Oh, great. I now have a watch. Yes. I was told I have a maximum of 3 hours. Because in order to enable everybody to do something practical, we want to finish with a brief summary of the 613 commandments. When Menachem Mendel became, 1951, the Rebbe of Chabad, he ushered in a very, very different sort of age, because he set a goal for himself that I don't know if any other rabbinic leader had ever set. He wanted to reach every Jewish community in the world, and basically every Jew. And later on, the Rebbe also had aspirations about the impact that he wanted the Jewish world and Jews and Judaism to have on the non-Jewish world as well. I don't think it's totally coincidental that this agenda of the Rebbe happened just a few years after the Holocaust. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has put it, who himself was deeply influenced by the Rebbe, he said if the Nazis hunted down every Jew in hate, the Rebbe wanted to search out every Jew in love. And it ended up happening in a remarkable way. I mean, look at the growth of this community. I'm speaking tomorrow in the state that was the 50th state to establish a Chabad house. If you know the answer, don't give it. Does anybody want to guess which do you think was the last state to get a Chabad house? Somebody called out Montana. There is, however, a rabbi who's been there in Montana for a few years, Rabbi Brook, whose goal is, in light of what you were just saying, Rabbi, his goal is to get every Jewish household in Montana to have a mezuzah. And when I spoke to him, when I interviewed him for the book, he had just come from a town in Montana that actually sounds like a Jewish shtetl, Whitefish. I did this exercise recently, and invariably somebody guesses Hawaii, to which I always respond, let me ask you a question. If you were a Chabadnik and you were about to go on Schneerson, and they handed you a list of 50 states, you really think Hawaii would be last? But indeed, it is South Dakota, and I'm very excited about going there tomorrow, because the rabbi in South Dakota, Mendel, was my research assistant on this book, and I owe a great deal to Mendel. And there's now a Chabad house in over 100 countries. Every year, who knows the answer to this? This I suspect somebody will know. Where is the largest Seder in the world held? Thailand has very big Seder. Thailand has, yeah, you're right, it's Nepal, I'll speak about it in a minute. Thailand has major Seder, about 3,000, either 2,000 or 3,000 people come to 6 Sederim in 6 different cities in Thailand. Now obviously, what's the one city everybody knows in Thailand? What? Bangkok. But can any of you name more than one city in Bangkok? They have Siddharam there with hundreds of people. My friend Dennis Prager some years ago spent a Shabbat at the Chabad in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. There were 17 people staying at the Shabbat meal. When I was growing up, you didn't think there would be any Jewish context in Cambodia, let alone a really frum context. Eric Yaffe, the longtime head of the Union for Reform Judaism, said 10 years after the Rebbe was nifter, after the Rebbe's death, it's hard for me to say this, but I will say it. We must follow the example of Chabad. So what I really set out to do in the book is, it's a biography of the Rebbe, but it's really a biography of his years of leadership. Because I really wanted to study how did a man so fast, he didn't create the movement, obviously he was the 7th Rebbe, and Chabad had been in existence for a long time, but he was the first of the Rebbeim to have his whole career as a Rebbe in the United States, which was very different from Jewish life in Eastern Europe. And because of the Rebbe, he made it even more different, and because of his accomplishments. And one of the fascinating things about the Rebbe is his influence and impact and his concern was not restricted to Jews. I'll just tell you one of the stories that I tell in the book. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm was elected as the first black woman ever elected to Congress. Later on, she became the first black who ever tried to secure a presidential nomination. Anyway, so she's elected to Congress, and she represents Bedford-Stuyvesant area, which is an area in Brooklyn, and she also represents a large part of Crown Heights. In fact, she was also the Rebbe's congresswoman. She comes to Congress. Remember, 1968 was only 4 years after the passage of the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Bill. And Congress was still controlled in many ways by Southern Democrats, many of whom were racists. And so they weren't happy that this black woman suddenly ended up in Congress, so they put her on the Agriculture Committee, leading one New York newspaper to headline, "A Tree Grows in Brooklyn." Now, obviously, she was unhappy, and she was very public about her unhappiness. She said, "I came to Congress, I want to be on an education committee, I want to be on a labor committee, and they've marginalized me and put me on the agriculture committee." She receives a phone call from Rabbi Chodakov, who was the Rebbe's top aide, and said, "The Rebbe would like to meet with you." She knew who the Rebbe was. All New York politicians knew the Rebbe because they would characteristically come to the Rebbe, they would get a blessing. The Rebbe obviously was not partisan, he would not publicly endorse a candidate. So Chisholm comes, and the Rebbe says to her, "I understand you're very unhappy about what's been done." And she says, "I'm unhappy, I'm insulted, I've been very hurt." And the Rebbe surprises her. He says to her, "What a blessing God has given you. This country has so much surplus food, and there are so many hungry people, and you can use this gift that God's given you to feed hungry people. You just need to find a creative way to do it." She arrives in Congress, and on her first day in Congress, she meets the newly elected senator, a former congressman from Kansas, a Republican. It was actually a time in American history when Democrats and Republicans could find issues they agreed about. And so she meets Bob Dole. Bob Dole represents Kansas, which is obviously a very agricultural state. There was surplus food that was being created, was not being really utilized. It was a catastrophe for the farmers, and they worked together, and together with him, she plays a major role in expanding food stamps. Then a few years later, she plays the prominent role in establishing WIC, which is the program for women and infants, and other children, because there was such a lack there. The Rebbe's impact on her was not widely known until 15 years later, when she retired from Congress, and at a breakfast that was made in honor of her by her admirers, she told the story of that encounter with the Rebbe. And then she said, "A rabbi who was an optimist taught me that what you think is a challenge is a gift from God." And she then added, "If poor babies have milk and poor children have food, it's because this rabbi in Crown Heights had vision." So right away we know we're dealing with a different sort of figure. Now, Rabbi Herlick, in his opening comments, focused on what was a part of it, because as I said, I was really interested in studying what made the Rebbe different as a leader. Well, one of his approach, which influenced all of Chabad, was his belief that every act counts. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. I was born in 1948. I will save you time, I'm 70. So I was born in 1948. And so I remember John Kennedy's president. How many of you remember when John Kennedy was president? Okay, so quite a number of you. I mention it because 2 days ago, my wife and I went to a play on Broadway, and we took along my 14-year-old nephew. And he's telling us, it's about his freshman year in high school, and he said, "And my English teacher, she's into her 80s. I said, "Really? Did she tell you her age?" She said, "Oh, no, but she's definitely into her 80s. She was a sophomore in high school when Kennedy was assassinated." So I said to him, "Guess what? I was a sophomore in high school." So anyway, but I remember when John Glenn, the astronaut, circled the world, Kennedy gave a very famous speech in which he predicted that by the end of the decade of the 60s, there would be a man on the moon. And in describing all those efforts, Kennedy, either in that speech or another one, quoted the famous Chinese aphorism, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." And when I heard that, it reminded me of the Rebbe in the sense that he knew any one mitzvah that you start, can lead to a bigger, to much more of a commitment. The more I worked on the book, the more I worked on studying the Rebbe's life, I realized that Chinese aphorism didn't really summarize what the Rebbe thought. His thinking was, in a way, even more radical. The underlying presumption of that statement, I love to see the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, is that every step matters because it's part of the journey of 1,000 miles. The Rebbe's approach was a very interesting one. He believed that every step mattered in and of itself, even if it didn't culminate in a journey of 1,000 miles. This was a radically different approach, because the general approach in the Orthodox world was to focus on sins. It was much more. So if somebody sometimes lit candles but didn't, so they didn't observe Shabbos or other things, he focused on what they did do. I'll give you an example. He actually started in 67, but 74 was when the tefillin campaign took off. For those of you who don't know what tefillin are, they are phylacteries. Now, the truth is, the only thing you know is that if somebody uses the word phylacteries, they don't put them on. But in any case, so suddenly in 1974, the group Young Chabadniks in New York, where the campaign really started, would stop people in the street. If it was a man, they'd say, or a woman, they'd say, "Are you Jewish? And did you put on tefillin?" And if they didn't, they would put on tefillin with them. They'd take them into a truck that was an open, big rider truck that was right near there. And if it was women, they would ask them, "Are you Jewish?" And if they answered yes, they'd give them a little kit that would enable them to light Shabbat candles. Not surprisingly, many secular Jews, or less observant Jews, were very uncomfortable with the tefillin campaign. Because, first of all, a lot of Jews, for very understandable reasons, are uncomfortable with anybody stopping them on the street and saying, "Are you Jewish?" But they also are uncomfortable because, to them, so you have to think about it, secular Jews, tefillin seems like something pretty primitive, and all of a sudden the people are wrapping it around. What's less well known, however, is that even within the Orthodox world, and in what sometimes thought was the ultra-Orthodox world, there was criticism of the tefillin campaign. Why? They thought it was absurd. So you're going to get somebody to put on tefillin, and then he'll take them off, and then he'll go into a restaurant and get ham and eggs or something. It has no purpose. The Rebbe thought it did have a purpose. He said, appreciate every person for the mitzvah they do, and don't focus on what they're violating or what they're not doing, because the only way you're going to affect, first of all, the mitzvah in and of itself, he had this notion that just putting on tefillin once at least puts you in a different category. So the mitzvah had a very, very important implication. On January 1st, 2000, in other words, the first day of the new millennium, the New York Times published a special edition. It had 3 front pages. One front page was for January 1st, 2000. The second front page was for January 1st, 1900. To give people an idea of what life had been like in the preceding century. The third was for January 1st, 2100, in which people, the writers who were hired to do it, theorized on what the world, made up stories about what the world might be like. And, so you had a headline, should robots be allowed to vote in elections? And, you had strange things. In the middle of the page, there was a little classified ad. Jewish women and girls. Sabbath candle lighting will be today at 5:18. Now, I don't know, how many of you are New Yorkers? I don't know if you remember, but you might have been here for a long time. There was a period of time when for several years, a Chabad philanthropist paid to have an ad on the front page of the New York Times, a little classified ad telling women whatever time Shabbat was going to be. And again, one of the distinctive approaches of the Rebbe was he wanted girls 3 and over to light candles. Actually, he wanted girls 3 and over to make the blessing on the candle. The Rebbe did not want 3-year-old girls playing with matches. Okay, so how did this come about? I go to a shul on 110th Street in Manhattan called Ramat Torah. And you know the way shuls sometimes are named after shtetls that people came from? Ramat Torah is named after the Jews from Luxembourg, whose chief rabbi got them got many, many of them out. Anyway, so I sit next to my friend Ari Goldman, who was a reporter for 20 years on the New York Times, and as far as I know, was the only reporter the Times ever hired, with the proviso that he didn't have to work on Shabbat or on holidays. So he told me the background of that story. It turned out there was a guy who was editing the front page for January 1st, 2100, and that was his job. And he suddenly realized that January 1st, 2100, he looked it up in a calendar, it was going to be a Friday. So he called up Chabad headquarters and said, what time will candlelighting be on January 1st, 2100? Now, you know, these things haven't been all worked out. I presume he was told, if the Mashiach has not come and taken us. So, and he gave him the time, and they put it in. That story is obviously funny, but it also is an extraordinarily revealing story about a very unusual aspect of Chabad. As a general rule, all the major denominations in Jewish life basically receive the overwhelming majority of their contributions from members of that denomination. If you would find out who are the biggest givers to the Hebrew Union College building fund, obviously it's going to be overwhelmingly comprised of Reform Jews. The same goes for the conservative movement, the same goes for the other Orthodox movements. Chabad's the one exception. And I think that story helps explain why. There are many American Jews who feel passionate about their Jewishness. They think it's very important, they want it to continue, and they're by no means certain that their great-grandsons and great-granddaughters are going to continue to be identified as Jews, or if they do so, very minimally. The one thing they're sure of is that in January 1st, 2100, there will be Chabadniks calling up people to make sure that they've lit Shabbos candles. And I think that explains why they were so able to go beyond just their own movement. So what are some of the things that really characterize the Rebbe? One thing that everybody knows about him is he loved all Jews and he put great focus on that. So on the one hand, one could say, what's the chiddush? What's the big new insight? Love your neighbor as yourself, which appears smack in the middle of the Torah. It's in the third book of the Torah, Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18, has long been understood to be a very centrally defining mitzvah, so much so that Rabbi Akiva, the great Talmudic sage, said, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, zeh klal gadol b'Torah." Love your neighbor as yourself, this is or it can also be translated as the major principle of the Torah. A century before Akiva, Hillel famously defined Judaism by saying, "Da'alech hasani," what's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor. So on the one hand, it doesn't seem that radical that he put this great emphasis on love. But on the other hand, guess what? What people preach ideally doesn't always get carried out. In fact, what do I mean? If you look in the Talmud, you find a very famous Talmudic passage attributes the destruction of the Second Temple to sinat chinam, to causeless hatred in the Jewish community, enmity, which struck at the very roots of Jewish unity. And they were right. I'll give you an example from Jewish history. In 1240, one of the terrible events of the Middle Ages occurs. There's a public burning of the Talmud in Paris. Now, obviously, any time the Talmud is burned, it's a tragedy. But what made it so particularly tragic was, think about it. In 1240, there were no printing presses. Every one of the 24 cartloads of books of the Talmud that was burned had been handwritten by somebody. You can imagine the efforts that went into it. The question is, how did it come about? In 1232, the Catholic Church had given a mission to the Dominican order in France to set up an inquisition to catch heretics and to burn heretical books. But obviously the church was only referring to heretical Christian books. In those days there was no Protestantism, so Catholicism basically was the voice of Christianity. And they were doing it. And then 3 rabbis came to the Dominicans and they said there was a Jewish writer who was a heretic. His book should be burned. And they gave over 2 books of Moses Maimonides, Rambam. They said his Mishnah Torah, the opening volume of Sefer Hamada,
had heretical thoughts in it, and the same thing was said about the Moreh, the Guide to the Perplexed. Once the Dominicans burned those books, so then they started looking into other Jewish, quote, heretical books, and some Jewish apostates brought them things from the Talmud that they didn't like, and when the Talmud was burned, one of those three rabbis, Rabbi Yonah Gerundi, was overtaken with such guilt for what he had done. He wanted to go pray at Maimonides' grave. In those days it wasn't so easy to travel. He writes a book, which to this day is studied in yeshivas. There's a classic work on repentance, Sharei Tshuva, the gates of repentance. But what he had to repent for was, in an excess of zeal, he had the writings of Maimonides burned. So this was exactly the attitude the Rebbe wanted to counter. I'll give you a few examples. Israel Meir Lau, who was one of the very prominent chief rabbis of Israel, as a young man, he was already ordained as a rabbi, came to see the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asked him, so what sort of work are you doing now in Israel? He said, I'm involved in Kiruv Rechokim. Kiruv Rechokim literally means in Hebrew, bringing near those who are far away, but it's an expression that's used for people who try and get secular Jews to come closer to Judaism. And the Rebbe said, I wouldn't use that language. How do we know who's Karov? How do we know who's Rachov? He said, I wouldn't use that language. Do we really know who's near and who's far away? They're all dear in God's eyes. Right away, he doesn't want the religious Jews who were teaching others to do so from a position of elitism. I have something, you don't have anything to offer me, but I have something to offer you. You know, people don't respond best in that situation. I'll tell you another story from a man who, I was at a conference 2 days ago. We were together, but who I spoke a lot of the book with, George Rohr. The Rohr family, starting with George's dad, are among the biggest, maybe even are the biggest, but certainly among the biggest givers to Chabad. But George is also himself a highly knowledgeable Jew. And he attends a synagogue on the Upper East Side called KJ, Tehilas Yeshurim, a modern Orthodox shul. And one year he started there a beginner's service for the high holidays. What's a beginner's service? You know, a lot of Jews who go to the high holidays are Jews who don't necessarily go to synagogue often the rest of the week, who aren't really comfortable with Hebrew, and the sheer quantity of prayers that you could have. You ever see an art scroll sitter for Rosh Hashanah, for Yom Kippur? It's like 1,000 pages, you know, and so they can't say all the prayers. So he would pick out certain prayers so that people really knew what they were praying. Between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, he went to see the Rebbe, and he says to the Rebbe, I want the Rebbe to know that I conducted services on Rosh Hashanah for 130 Jews with no background. The Rebbe looks up at him, doesn't say anything, but if anything, he looks a little displeased. So the Rebbe was really quite old at that time, so George did what many of us do when an old person doesn't respond. He said the same thing over in a much louder voice. He said, I want the Rebbe to know I conducted Rosh Hashanah for 130 Jews with no background. And the Rebbe said to him, what do you mean they have no background? They're the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. They're the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Again, it puts it all into a different context, and that was what it was like. The other secret of the Rebbe in carrying out acts of love is he very much focused and encouraged focusing on the individual. I'll tell you one story from my family, which probably has a lot to do with why I ended up writing this book, because I've written quite a number of books. This is the book that occupies, I worked on this for 5 years, you know, the research and the writing of it. And the truth of the matter is that one of the great blessings in life is not to know the future. When I got involved with it, it was agreed I was going to work on the book for 2 years. It's good I didn't know in advance. It turned out to be 5 extraordinary years, but I didn't think it would necessarily be that long. But anyway, a story from my own family. My father, Shlomo Telushkin, alav shalom, was an accountant, and for 40 years, over 40 years, he was the Rebbe's accountant. He was actually the accountant even for the Rebbe's father-in-law, the 6th Rebbe, from the time that Chabad came to America. My father never had a super lucrative practice, but he loved his practice because he was passionately involved in Jewish life, And so he was the accountant for Chabad, he was the accountant for Mizrahi, a religious Zionist movement, he was accountant for Ezra's Torah, but he was, and he loved doing it. But Chabad was very special. He always said to me, I will never retire. It was only when I was researching the book that I found out that was a very characteristic teaching of the Rebbe. He never wanted people to retire. As a rabbi who told him he was retiring, the Rebbe answered him, why do you want to retire from life? So he was not a fan of retirement. But in any case, in 1986, I'm living in Israel, and I get a phone call you dread, from my mother. My dad had a stroke. He was in a coma. He was unconscious. And of course, I came back right away. Every day, I would get 2 phone calls from Chabad. The Rebbe wants to know how your father is. Eventually, I had the great blessing. I was with my father when he came out of the coma, and we continued to get the calls every day. But 5 days after my father came out of the coma, he was still in ICU, the intensive care unit. I get a call from Rabbi Krinsky, a very close aide of the Rebbe. He said a question. We had a meeting on Holo. We had a meeting here of the leadership. An accounting question came up, and the Rebbe said, ask Shlomo. And the Rebbe was well aware. Somebody said to him, you know what happened. Shlomo was very sick. He said, I know. Ask him this question. So once I hear that, I was shocked at first. I said to him, I can't ask my father a accounting question. But once he said the Rebbe had been so specific, so I went in and I asked my father the question, and he looked at me calmly and he gave an answer. I was profoundly moved because I realized what had happened. Sitting in his office in Brooklyn, dealing with world affairs and all sorts of affairs with Jews throughout the world, he was also thinking about my father, who was lying in a hospital bed. I always said my father was like somebody who was running full speed into a brick wall. Because on the day that he had his stroke, he could no longer practice accounting, and my father used to give a weekly shiur, a weekly class in Talmud. He was no longer able to do that. And needless to say, it's a very upsetting experience. And the Rebbe knew that. But I realized it was even more than that, what the Rebbe was doing. The Rebbe had a profound sense of what I like to call moral imagination, because he had to think through an appropriate question. He didn't want to ask a question that would be so simple that my father would feel he was being treated as if, in a condescending way. And he certainly didn't want to ask a question that my father wouldn't be able to answer, which would make him even more depressed. I'll give you another example like this. Rabbi Shmuel Kaplan has been now for over 40 years the head shliach, there are a lot more shluchim, in Baltimore. Very early in his career, he had gotten smicha, and he was studying a kollel for young married men who've been married and who want to be able to devote their time for a few years to study. And Rabbi Chodakov, the Rebbe's close aide, came and told him that there was a young woman, about 17, who was going through a period of very intense sort of rebellions and great unhappiness, and she was in depressions and she was angry, and the Rebbe wanted him to devote time to working with her. And he did for several months, and the young woman used to write letters to the Rebbe. Kaplan said he was amazed. The Rebbe would always respond within a day or two. And he said it was like, teenage problems, but times 10, that she really had it. And on one occasion, she wrote a letter to the Rebbe describing the emotional pain she felt. And we all can think back to our teen years. There's an intensity of emotion that is often felt by teenagers. And she described her pain. And the Rebbe wrote back to her, I feel your pain. This answer didn't help. She felt the Rebbe was being condescending. And she was very angry. And she wrote back, said, how can you say you feel my pain? You don't know what I'm really going through. And Kaplan told me, within 2 hours, the following response came from the Rebbe. When you will merit to grow up and marry, and God willing have a child, the nature of things are that in the first year, towards the end of the first year, a child begins to teethe. And teething is a painful process, and the child cries as a result. And the mother feels that pain as if it were her own. That is how I feel your pain. Kaplan told me when I spoke to him about it that was the breakthrough. That was the first time the girl felt that there was somebody who really understood her and really identified her. Now, this happened many years ago. He said she's now a grandmother, and she's ended up having a very happy life. But it's very powerful how the Rebbe expressed that law and applied it to individuals. Another aspect of Chabad, which is often not properly understood, was the Rebbe's ability to empower people. A lot of people thought that the Rebbe wanted followers. And it was obvious, for obvious reasons, one could easily think that. Look at the intense devotion that his followers have to him. But what the Rebbe really wanted to do was he wanted to create leaders, which when you really think about it, is what he ended up doing. I mean, when you came out here to Las Vegas, I don't think you would have automatically thought that some years later you would have 16 rabbis, here full time. He wanted to create leaders. Label Groner, who was another one of the Rebbe's very close aides, his first children he had twin boys. And he came to the Rebbe, he asked him a halachic question. I can just tell you what the question was. Does the man conducting the circumcision, the person conducting the circumcision, make one bracha and then circumcise both boys, or does each one get a separate bracha? So he asked the Rebbe this question, and the Rebbe was known that he, as a rule, did not like to answer halachic questions because he was afraid. He was smart. He was afraid that then people would start asking all their questions to him, and guess what? It would disempower local rabbis. So he liked to send people back to their own rabbis. But for Groner, he really was his rabbi. So this was the first interview I did for the book, which is, I think, why Groner told me this. At the beginning, the Rebbe sent him to my grandfather, Mr. Telushkin. And he goes to my grandfather, and my grandfather was very uncomfortable answering a question that had been directed to the Rebbe. He felt very peculiar doing it, and so he also was evasive. So Groner went back to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said to him, listen, you're like me. I have smicha, rabbinic ordination. You have rabbinic ordination. You go and answer it and tell me your conclusion. The conclusion is that a male should make a separate bracha for each of the children. But he empowered Groner. He empowered him. He said, use your own resources. I'll give you another example of a rabbi named Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. I'm going to ask you to remember his name because his name is basic to the story. So Moshe Yitzchak Hecht becomes a shliach, an emissary, in New Haven. And you know what? It can be very hard when you're an emissary in those early years. You have to raise money. You have to encourage people to come and pray. You have to do a whole host of things. And he finally felt he was encountering such difficulties that he wrote a letter to the Rebbe, and he said, Rebbe, I need you to help, and I need you to do it all. The Rebbe doesn't accede to his request, but he takes the discussion in a different direction. I have already done as you suggested. I sent to New Haven Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. It is apparent from your letters that you don't know this man. You don't know the strengths that were given to him. Try and get to know him now, and then everything will immediately change. The mood, the trust in God, the daily joy. In other words, he sent Hecht back to himself. There's another instance. The book, I was finally pretty much finishing with the book, and then I came across a story, and I wasn't looking to incorporate at that point new material, but it was too good a story, and I called up the man who was involved, whose name was Tzvi Hirsch Weinrib. Weinrib was not a Chabadnik, isn't a Chabadnik, but he has enormous respect for the Rebbe, and he, for many years, headed the OU, the organization known for giving out kosher, for kashrut, and he was also a big Talmid Chacham. He was also a scholar, to the extent that he, to this day, he is the English language editor of the translation of the Talmud into English, of the Schneerson's Talmud into English. So obviously, he's a scholar. Early in his life, Weinberg tells the story. He was about 30 years old. He was a bit of a wunderkind. He had done a lot by a relatively young age. He and his wife moved to Silver Spring, Maryland. And in Silver Spring, he's getting his PhD in child psychology. He's working at a local public school as a child psychologist, and he's giving Talmud classes at night. And he said he went at the age of 30 into a midlife crisis. First of all, he was overwhelmed. He was overwhelmed. Secondly, he didn't know, he couldn't make that decision which direction he wanted his life to take. You're doing 3 different jobs, and you can't decide between them. And he had some issues of faith that were coming up. And but he was a married man, he had 2 children, and he's describing his problems to a number of his friends. He said whenever he had problems, he liked to talk about them with other people, and one of them, a Chabadnik, said, why don't you call up the Rebbe and see if you can get an appointment? So he calls up the Rebbe's office. It becomes clear that the person he's speaking to is Rabbi Chodakov, and every once in a while he hears a voice in the background, asking something, and then the voice in the background, which Chodakov repeats, said, who are you? He says to the Chodakov, who are you speaking to? So Chodakov says to him, who are you? He didn't want to reveal his identity. If he was going to go meet with the Rebbe, obviously he would have. But because he was acknowledging things he was a little uncomfortable about, including some issues of faith and other things, so all he answered was a Jew from Maryland. Okay, the conversation continues and gets deeper, and he wants to come and see the Rebbe, but all of a sudden he hears that voice in the background say, tell him that there's a rabbi in Maryland you should go speak to. The rabbi's name is Weinberg. So he is shocked. By the way, this was in the days before caller ID. So he was so shocked that Chodakov said, did you hear what the Rebbe said? He said, I'm not sure I heard it correctly. He says, there's a Jew in Maryland named Weinberg, go and speak to him. Weinberg says, I'm Weinberg. Chodakov is now shocked. Chodakov tells this to the Rebbe. The Rebbe says, Azoi, if that's the case, then he should consult with himself. Weinberg claims that became a crucial event in his life. He said, I always had a bit of a nervous disposition. I was always the sort of person who, whenever I had a problem, I'd start confiding in people. What should I do? What should I do? He said, from that point on, whenever I have a problem, the first person I consult with is myself. I ask myself, what do I really want to see happen? How do I really want to see it happen? He says, I actually create a mood. He said, I go sit down in a comfortable chair. I usually read a few pages of a mimer or some writing of the Rebbe, and then I really look inside myself. And he said, it's amazing how often, without having to seek out other people's opinions, I can really come to an understanding myself of what I want. This was part of the Rebbe's method in establishing and bringing people to leadership. Because the first thing they need to know is yourself. The worst thing you can ever have is a leader who doesn't know himself. Because he's going to have inconsistent reactions, he'll have angry reactions sometimes. There's no consistency. But another aspect of becoming a leader came out in a meeting that he had with a man who was then only 21 or 22, Jonathan Sachs. Sachs went on to become the chief rabbi of England, but that was definitely not his intention. He said that if not for the Rebbe, he wouldn't have become a rabbi. He wanted to become a philosopher or an economist or a lawyer. But he came to the Rebbe and was very impacted. But he recalls one thing from that first meeting. At a certain point in the meeting, he said to the Rebbe, I recently found myself in a situation, And the Rebbe said, don't use that expression. Say, I placed myself in a situation. Because if you place yourself in a situation, then you can place yourself in another situation. If you think in terms of finding yourself in a situation, you then tend to think of yourself in passive terms. Think of yourself more so in active terms and things really that you can do to change that situation. And Sachs continues to insist how important this was in his whole development. So this was part of the Rebbe's work in developing leaders. Another feature of the Rebbe, in fact, an entire book has just come out on this feature, and it's a very important one, is the Rebbe's innate optimism. The Rebbe really did anticipate. I'm very cautious in writing and not making big claims for people unless I really think they can be truly substantiated. The Rebbe very much anticipated the insights of positive psychology. That is very much identified with a number of psychologists, one whose names I'm forgetting now. He's at the University of Pennsylvania, who's helped develop this whole field. Positive psychology, he wants to focus on the strengths of people. He said such advances have been made in dealing with all sorts of mental depressions and other things. He said, but what about also helping people to become healthier and more positive in their lives? And the Rebbe was therefore very cautious in his usage of words. I'll give you an example. early on when I started working on the book, one of the people I spent quite a bit of time with is a rabbi named Sivan Jacobson. Sivan was a very prominent figure within Chabad. He used to be one of those, when the Rebbe would give, the Rebbe would speak on Shabbos on Yom Tov, and he would speak in Yiddish, and he didn't have notes. And you obviously can't tape record him. So Shimon was a choser, one of those who would get together that evening after the holiday had ended and remember what the Rebbe had said, and they would write it up. But Shimon told me an interesting thing, that this way I'll know how many people here know some Hebrew. Call out the answer. Who knows how to say hospital in Hebrew? You seem to, are you Israeli? Okay, why am I not to know? I can recognize your accent. Okay, what is Beit Cholim? It means obviously hospital, but what does it literally mean? The house of sick people. When Sivan told me that, it reminded me of something my mother had told me probably 45 years ago, that when she was growing up, there were hospitals in New York called Home for the Incurables. There were Jewish homes for the incurables, there were Catholic homes for the incurables. Can you imagine saying to somebody, by the way, we're transferring you tomorrow to, And my mother said, when you were a kid, you just accept the reality of it. It was only as she got older that she realized how horrible that designation was. I was once reading a biography of Yossele Rosenblatt. Yossele was considered one of the great cantors in Jewish life in America. And he had performed at the Montefiore Home for the Incurables, and he got a thank you letter from Jacob Schiff, who was the president of the hospital, and at that time the biggest philanthropist in Jewish life. And Schiff thanks him for all the comfort and good cheer you brought to the inmates. And I remember I was thinking, Genug, it's enough already. They're at the Home for the Incurable, you have to call them inmates? And so the Rebbe campaigned, and it's starting to bear some effect, to hospitals in Israel to stop using that term, but instead use the term Beit Refuah, house of healing. And in his appeal to the hospitals, he said, not only is that a more encouraging term to people, it's a more accurate term. You don't want to be a house of the sick. You want to be a house where people heal. Similar to that, 1976, a delegation of soldiers from Israel arrived in the United States. People who are known as Nechei Tzahal. Nechei Tzahal means the handicapped of Tzahal. And it referred, obviously, to soldiers who suffered irreparable wounds. And they were being brought over to the United States, both to show them somewhat of a good time, but also for some consultations. And one of the places they went to was 770. They went to meet the Rebbe. And the Rebbe, in speaking to them, the Rebbe very rarely gave a public speech in Hebrew. Obviously, his primary language that he spoke publicly in was Yiddish. Later on, often with the Russian Jews, he'd speak Russian. And he didn't. And he started out, he asked for pardon from the soldiers. He said, I know I have a very strong Ashkenazic accent. And the way Ashkenazic Jews often pronounce Hebrew words is quite different from the standard Sephardic pronunciation. But anyway, he said to the people, I know in Israel they call you Nechei Tzahal, the handicapped of Tzahal. He said, but it's also known that handicapped people develop other capabilities. For example, blind people often develop a more acute sense of hearing. It's not that they hear better, but they can interpret what they're hearing to know what it means. If you would Google and go online and Google in that you want to see paintings that were done by people without brushes, people who are holding the paintbrush in their mouth or holding it with their toes, you would be shocked at the quality of paintings you would see. So he said, I know that all of you develop certain abilities that far exceed others. Why then should you only be defined by what you can't do? Why can't you be defined by what you can do and do very well? Why can't you be known as Mitsuyanei Tzahal, the extraordinary ones of Tzahal, rather than the term that immediately labels you? When I came across that, it reminded me of a book I had written decades earlier, written by an American soldier from World War II who had lost his arms and was sent to an army rehab hospital. And the day before they were released from the hospital, he and other soldiers a doctor practicing a form of what they call sort of tough, realistic love, said to them, this year you're all going to be Army heroes. Next year you're going to be wounded veterans. 2 years later after that, you're going to be cripples. Compare that with how he sent them out into the world, with how the Rebbe sent them out into the world. The Rebbe felt that words so impact us, and it's so important that we realize that. I suspect if you could listen in at a therapist's office with children, voicing complaints about things that happened in their childhood, a lot has to do with parents who used wrongful language to them, who used language to them that made them feel very inadequate. And you know what? Parents are a very big influence on children because they sort of model themselves on parents. It's the adults they see the most of, and they can do very great harm. The Rebbe, therefore, was vigilant in not wanting people to use negative words. I'll just give you one example from my own life, how I got affected. A basic word to any writer, and to people in many fields, is deadline. The Rebbe hated that word. Think about it. What does it connote? Death. So I started using due date. What's the difference between a deadline and a due date? One connotes death, the other connotes emerging life. And you know what? It has a difference. You use the word deadline and you have a sense of dread, about what was going on. I was very careful in the writing of my book to not use anonymous stories. I remember very early on when I spoke to Rabbi Groner, he said, anybody can challenge an anonymous story. Who knows? And the truth is, anonymous stories often really can be exaggerated and other things. But there was one story that I really couldn't pin down, but I heard it from so many different people, I'm assuming it was rooted in some reality. A man came to meet with the Rebbe, and he's talking about his life, and he's upset with this, he's upset with that, and he's very upset because one of his children has turned out not to be religious, and then he sort of slapped his hand against his head and said, yeah, you know what they say, es ist schwer zu sein ein Yid. It's hard to be a Jew. How many of you, whether in Yiddish or English, have ever heard that expression? Yeah, quite a number. It's a well-known expression. So the Rebbe said to the man, I'm curious, do you use that expression often? And the man said, well, it is hard to be a Jew. So the Rebbe said, well, so then why are you surprised your son doesn't want to be a Jew? He said, there's another expression you can use. Es ist gut zu sein ein Yid. It's good to be a Jew, and you'll change the whole mood. Give you another instance of an important teaching of the Rebbe. How to disagree without being disagreeable. And believe me, I'm only choosing teachings that I think apply to a fair number of people in this room. Anybody here who's ever had a fight with somebody they really cared about? And how many of your families, at the level of first cousin and closer, are there relatives who are not on speaking terms? Okay, a lot. And other people aren't raising their hands, but they might, if they think about it. Okay, I'll extend it. And how many of your families at the level of fourth cousin the Rebbe once gets a letter from a rabbi who disagreed profoundly with him on a certain issue. And the Rebbe writes back to him, let's remember, there are still 612 areas on which we agree. Obviously, he was speaking metaphorically, but what happens is, very often when there is a conflict, we focus on that conflict as if that's the most important and that's the defining issue. And once you disagree over that issue, to hell with it. So there'll be no other relationship, or that's what you always associate with the person. And the Rebbe always was searching out for commonalities. He didn't immediately find excuses. Michal Seligson, who compiled probably the fattest book in my book collection, 1,600 pages, big, tall book, an index to all of the Rebbe's sichot, an index to all of the Rebbe's speeches. He said he didn't remember coming across an instance where the Rebbe had attacked someone by name. That's a very big deal. The Rebbe said, I don't speak about people, I speak about shitot. I don't speak about individuals, I speak about approaches. Does that have implications? Yes. I came across an instance where the Rebbe attacked the position of somebody very, very strongly on an issue on which they disagreed, but he didn't mention the man's name. And then, less than a year later, the Rebbe called up that person on another issue on which they could work together, and they were able to work together. Had he mentioned the man's name in his public attack the first time, would they then have been able to work together? One of the things, I alluded to this earlier when I was speaking about the political problems in America, it's very hard when you've attacked a person's character. Every 4 years, when there's a presidential election in the United States, I like to ask audiences, can you think of a single reason somebody's voting for the candidate you oppose that doesn't reflect badly, on either the person's character or on the person's intelligence? I rarely find liberals or conservatives who come up with one reason why somebody would vote for the other side. But then that causes a terrible problem, because it means that you either think 50% of Americans are stupid or they're bad. And more likely it's going to be the latter. Because what happens if somebody who you know to be intelligent supports somebody who you really dislike? It can only be because there's something bad about them. The Rebbe didn't want to see that happen. He wanted to search on commonalities. So he said, let's keep it confined to the issues and this issue rather than labeling somebody in a way we don't want. I'm going to just conclude with one more theme. How many of you grew up with your parents? I'm going to say a sentence and I'm going to leave out the last word, and I want people to call out the last word. Anything worth doing is worth doing well. That's really the way it was most commonly said. Anything worth doing is worth doing well. What I drew out of the Rebbe's teaching is anything worth doing is worth doing now. A couple of people actually did call that out. And I'll give you an example. A rabbi named Shapsi Katz, follower of the Rebbe, who lives in Pretoria, South Africa, the capital of South Africa. It's really right outside Johannesburg. Visits the Rebbe in 1978. He is the chaplain for Jews in prison. I think he had a small congregation, but he was a chaplain for Jews in prison. In 78, most of the Jews who were in prison in South Africa were in prison for political offenses. It was obviously the height of the time when the battle against apartheid was taking place. Quite a number of Jews were involved in it. And the Rebbe said to him, which holidays does the government accept for prisoners to really take off and observe? And South Africa is probably not surprising, certainly at that time. It's not good to be a prisoner, believe me, in the United States, but it was worse to be a prisoner there. And he said 3 holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Pesach. Obviously, on 2 of them, Rosh Hashanah and Pesach, he would bring in special food and do other things. And the Rebbe said, and are they allowed to light candles on Hanukkah? And Katz says, no. The Rebbe says, do you know how important it is? The Rebbe thought in poetic terms also. He said, do you know how important it is for somebody in the darkness of a prison cell to be able to light a candle? Do you know how much bad feelings, bad ill will, other things, the light of that candle, how much hope there is? We know that. Look, we all know that because in households where women light candles, it's becomes something very emotional and something very beautiful people can identify with. He speaks so movingly that Katz promises that next year he's going to do everything in his power to make sure that the Jewish prison will be allowed to light candles. But the Rebbe says to him, what about this year? Katz looks at him in astonishment. It's going to be Hanukkah in 2 days. What can I do? I'm here in your office. He says, well, you have the phone number of the head chaplain. He says, call him. Katz says, it's the middle of the night in South Africa. The Rebbe says, Adarabba, just the opposite. He'll realize it must be something very important. You can imagine all of us in Katz's position. The last thing we want to do is call up basically your boss in the middle of the night. But the Rebbe gave him no choice. He goes out of the Rebbe's office. One of the Rebbe's aides, takes him to a room, gives him a phone, and said, make any. In those days, it was a little more complicated to make international phone calls. Katz does a funny thing. He calls up his secretary and says, call the man and tell him he's going to be receiving a call from me in a few minutes. But anyway, he then calls the guy, General Sefton, I remember, who was himself a Christian missionary, not a Christian missionary, a Christian clergyman. And he says, I'm sitting here with one of the great rabbis of the world. And he then starts to explain about Hanukkah. Fortunately, the call concludes with General Sefton saying to him, I'm going to send out a telex tomorrow to all the prisons. that Jews should be allowed to light Hanukkah candles. So what I really wanted to do tonight was just give you a few examples and think about the examples that we spoke about. First of all, the focusing on one thing at a time in the Tefillin campaign, and that any act of a mitzvah is worthwhile. Don't focus, as is often done, on what the person is not yet doing. Focus on what they are doing, because that feeling of the sanctity of what they're doing will make them feel very pleased, and often will lead them to want to find other ways to do it. The unending love, what he did, in my sense, with my father, who had such a low point in his life, or what he did for the girl that Rabbi Kaplan was working with. Kach ani margish tzarech. That's how I feel your sorrow. Creating leaders. Think about also, it was wonderful what he said to Jonathan Sachs. When Sachs said, I found myself in a situation, the Rebbe said, don't say that. Say you placed yourself in a situation. If you can place yourself in one situation, now you can place yourself in another. Optimism, the careful choosing of words. The campaign to change the names of hospitals in Israel to Beit Refuah, houses of healing, to not use no deadlines. I remember I had great satisfaction when my book came out several years ago. I was speaking in El Paso, Texas. And I got 300 people in El Paso, which shows how much interest there is in the Rebbe. But my greatest nachas came the next day. Somebody sent me a notice, was sent out by the El Paso Jewish Federation. We no longer will use the word deadline. You never know. The focus on how to disagree without being disagreeable. What he said to that rabbi, who was so profoundly upset with him, and he said to him, remember there's 612 issues on which we still agree. Remember that when you're in a conflict with another person. Because that's where animosity and demonization takes place, though. The notion that anything is worth doing now, and don't keep postponing things. I'm just going to conclude with one final story. One of the people I met while I was doing research on the book, Avraham Berkowitz, who's now a man probably now in his mid-40s, but when he was a young guy, he was a yeshiva student, he was about 19 or 20. Chabad will only send out a shluchim of people who are already married. And it's actually, when people say that there are over 4,000 shluchim, it's actually inaccurate. There are over 8,000 shluchim, because both members of the couple are shluchim. And it's very, very important to do that. And, because the term Rebbitzin, obviously in the Orthodox world, you have Rebbitzins who are women. Obviously now in all the other movements of Judaism outside of Orthodoxy, they also ordain women. But it's been known, you can't, when they're interviewing a rabbi, if it's a man or if it's a woman, you can't ask them what role is your spouse going to play in the synagogue. But the truth of the matter is, you get two rabbis or two figures who are doing all the Jewish activities that need to be done. And it doubles the impact very much of what Chabad is doing. Anyway, but when people are not yet married, so they'd send young men out during the summer, and Berkowitz and his friend were sent out to Alaska. And they decided they were going to try and find Jews in outlying areas in Alaska. Chabadniks are not known for being shy. So they established contact with an Israeli pilot who was working for a domestic Alaskan airline that flew to the other cities in Alaska. And basically he would call them when he saw that there were going to be empty seats on the plane. And he'd allow them to come along with the understanding either they were going to fly out when he flew out, or they'll wait the next day or whatever will happen. Anyway, they arrived in the northwest Yupok territory in a town. It was a town, actually, interestingly, that obviously was based on the Bible, because the town was called Bethel, but obviously it was Beit El, which is of course comes from the Torah. Anyway, but it comprised of Native Americans. Native Americans in the lower 48 states usually, of course, refers to people who used to be called Indians, and in Alaska it refers to people who used to be called Eskimos, but who now use the title Inuits. So they arrive in this largely Inuit city. They immediately go over to there's a mayor's office. They find the mayor and they ask the mayor, are there any Jews who live here? And the mayor says, not that I know of. But the mayor was a somewhat sophisticated fellow, recognized that these two young men were obviously religious Jews. He said, the children at the school here, the elementary school, the 4th to 8th graders, never meet Jews. I would like you two to go there and talk to them. So they go to the school, they talk to the kids. The kids are very proud to show them Inuit dances. They even do a Hasidic dance for them. And then, before he leaves, Berkowitz says he knows that he's there as also as a shliach of the Rebbe. He's there as a representative of the Rebbe. He says, has anybody here ever met a Jew? One girl raises her hand and says, I know a Jew. So Berkowitz says, who do you know? She said, my mother. And her mother was there teaching in the school. So after the session, he goes over to speak to the girl and to the mother. And it turns out the woman came from what they call the lower 48. She always had a great love of nature. She had a positive feeling about her Jewishness, but she obviously was not particularly involved. She wouldn't have ended up in Bethel if she was. But she was, and then she says to Berkowitz, she said, look, my daughter might never meet a rabbi again. Tell her something that could always leave her feeling proud about being Jewish. And if you really think about it, I felt very challenged at that moment. He knew he had one opportunity to make an impression on this girl. And he said, every week the Jews observe the Sabbath. And it lasts, in actuality, it lasts actually a little more than 24 hours, because we started early and we ended a little late, it's about 25 hours. How is the Sabbath inaugurated? It's inaugurated by Jewish women who light 2 candles. He says, and it starts where the sun sets first. So where does the sun set first? And the girl knew geography. Her mom taught geography there. She said, well, probably like in Australia or New Zealand. And he said, and then it moves across, then it comes, and then it moves across Asia, certainly goes to Israel, then it comes, it moves across Europe, and then it comes now later then. And in each place we're waiting for the other people, they're all lighting. And then it comes to New York, comes to Chicago, comes to Seattle. And what's the major city? Anchorage, comes to Anchorage. And he said, and then it comes to the Northwest Yupok territory. And the whole world is waiting for you to light Shabbat candles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have some time for a few questions. Anyone? Rebbe. There we go.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Do you have that speech recorded by any chance? I want to hear you again.
That's very kind. I think if you YouTube, I think along the way, I've never supervised it, but I think somebody recorded it who really wasn't supposed to. It got posted. I mean, thank God there's nothing I said that but I think you could find it. If you YouTube Joseph Telushkin, I think you can find his speech.
You also can buy the book.
Yes, that's even a better way. And I will sign it to everyone. I'll stay here as late as I can, even though I have to have a 7 a.m. flight to South Dakota. Okay, yes.
How did the writing of this book affect you?
Well, I gave you a few examples. The most profound effect it had on me was a greater sense of cultivating optimism in my life and looking for the good. The third Chabad Rebbe, it was known as the Tzemach Tzedek, actually had the same name, Menachem, Mendel, Schneerson, and by odd coincidence, his wife had the same name. How many of you know the name of the Rebbe's, the first name? You should know it because it's by now far and away the most common name in Chabad. Chaim Mushka. Dina. No, Dina was the mother of. Okay. You were born while Chaim Mushka was still with us. Yes. So Chaim Mushka died, I think, in 87. 88. Okay. So from that point on, there's a famous photo of a parade of Chaim Mushkas. We have like hundreds of women pushing Chaim Mushkas in baby carriages. So, but in any case, I have no idea what I was talking about. Right. Oh, yeah. So the Tzemach Tzedek used to say, think good and it'll be good. I struggle with issues. I've gone through periods. I'm not going to start asking very intimate questions, but how many of you are on antidepressants? But like all of us, we go through periods. We're suffering from pressures. You can have pressures in your marriage. You can have pressures in your salary. You can have pressures with your children. And the Rebbe cultivated that usage of positive language was the most powerful thing. You know, earlier this year I reissued a book I had written 25 years ago called Words That Hurt, Words That Heal. If I would want to devote myself to one thing for the rest of my life, it would be on the issue of words. Because I've come across so much hurt that's been inflicted. And I was shocked. I never came across somebody who was so careful in how he used his words. Remember, the Rebbe had to speak a great deal, and how he used them in encouraging people, and that's what most affected me. There are other things too, but if I had to answer off the top of my head, that was it. And by the way, it's characteristic and a good thing, because the Rebbe had, first of all, the Rebbe's idea to get somebody to keep even one mitzvah. Whatever they do, pick something that matters to you. And it ties in with that thing. I've had a goal for many years to establish a National Speak No Evil Day in the United States. In fact, I was able to get, many years ago, Joe Lieberman, the Democratic senator from Connecticut, and Connie Mack, who was a Republican senator from Florida, to sponsor a resolution to establish a National Speak No Evil Day. And then I found out a terrible thing. You have to get at least like 50 senatorial co-sponsors if you want to make sure it happens. And I was a one-man band, and I always wanted to revive it, but now's not the easiest time to get it revived. There's too much animosity going on. But that's exactly, that whole notion. I have so many friends I live on the Upper West Side of New York, so you can imagine there are many people there with very powerful, emotional, political views, and I'm quite close with some people who are on the other side of it, and that notion also finding commonalities on issues on which we agree. I'll tell you a shocking story about the Rebbe, which I would not have put in, but I had two different people told me it was accurate. Zalman Schachter was Chabadnik, and he always remained in his heart a Chabadnik, but he somewhat drifted from the movement. But he was very moved. A few years before the Rebbe's death, he came to visit the Rebbe, and the Rebbe knew that he was a Kohen and asked for a blessing. Zalman was friendly with a Reform rabbi in Milwaukee, Dudley Weinberg, and he arranged for Weinberg to meet with the Rebbe. And the other person who was aware of this is I'm forgetting his first name, the Chabad Shliach in Milwaukee, who's a Shmatkin. No, but what's his first name? Yisrael. Oh, Yisrael, right, okay. So Yisrael Shmatkin also corroborated the story that Weinberg meets with the Rebbe and is so taken with the Rebbe, he wants to leave. He was a rabbi at a very big Reform congregation. And he said, so should I leave my congregation? He said, no, the Rebbe said that's where you can do work. You have to influence that congregation. And then the Rebbe said something really remarkable to him, which to a Chabadnik almost sounds funny, because you cannot imagine any Chabadnik saying what the Rebbe said to him. And he said to Weinberg, he said, and you should say to me, Schneerson, I'm not just somebody calling him Schneerson, you should say to me, Schneerson, look out the window and look at all the work you have to do. And so the Rebbe's, and believe me, the Rebbe didn't forfeit for 1 minute what he thought. His disagreements with Reform Judaism were profound. But he didn't then have to demonize or assume that there was no good that he could do, which is what happened when people disagree with him. I came across something that blew my mind. The Rebbe, one of the areas in which I actually had a disagreement with the Rebbe, and I was encouraged, in the first chapter of the book, I listed a couple of areas where I had different views. I had been very active in the Soviet Jewry protest movement. The Rebbe, for a variety of reasons, thought behind-the-scenes negotiation, and I came to understand why both things, in my view, could do good. And the Rebbe opposed the peace treaty with Sadat, which I thought was a good idea and remained to think was good. But the Rebbe was opposed to it. But anyway, when Jimmy Carter ceased to be president, when his term of office ended, as you know, Carter is not the most popular figure in the Jewish world today. But the Rebbe said an interesting thing. He said, I think Carter made some profound mistakes, But I do want to acknowledge that I think he did it out of a hope that doing so could save lives. And he said it's very common after a person ceases to have power to just recount all the bad things. He said, I'm not retracting a single word of why I thought the policy of that agreement with Egypt was a bad policy. But you can also acknowledge the good and the good intentions in another person. So, and believe me, this is not that easy. It's not my natural inclination when somebody's taking positions that I think are really terrible for me to spend a lot of time trying to find ways in which this doesn't reflect badly on them. You know, I'm like most of it. I have more of a temper. The Rebbe had that ability, and this more recently has started to have even bigger impact on me. I remember I wrote in the book, I said, I know that this study is going to affect me, but I suspect that in the years to come, its effect is going to grow. And that's one of them. Particularly as I see what's going on in America, because it really can destroy. Sinat chinam. You know, a causeless hatred where people lose a sense of commonalities, the rabbis say brought about the destruction of the Judean state. And terrible things can happen in America. So yes, I was deeply affected. Thank you.
Yes, my question is, you made a reference to Shirley Chisholm, but you focused upon her skin color. And what effects, just based on what you just said now, concerning the name of a person, why couldn't she just be referred to by her name? Because I get it often. I'm Jewish, but people are quick to look at the color of my skin and they'll reference, are you Jewish? Were you born or were you not born Jewish? So if we're going to think commonality, that's what we need to.
I'm sorry.
We need to do commonality. We need to unite and become one, because
You're
we're
right.
hot.
You're right.
We're one
Does
people.
somebody have a copy of my book? I want to read something then from it. Because I think it's important. I'll tell you why I think it's important to say it. Because a lot of Jews would not have thought that the Rebbe had the sense of empathy and concern with the African American community that he did. And I wanted them to say he is one of the exemplary figures in Jewish life, and that was the sort of person he was. I'm saying that more for the sake of the Jews, because this has been very unfortunate. But I'll tell you an example of something the Rebbe did, if I can find it very, very quickly. He's about as comfortable as people at a dinner table watching me. Okay, when the Rebbe met, there was a very unfortunate clash in Crown Heights, which really was between the Jewish and black communities there. And when David Dinkins, the mayor of New York, invoked, the hope that both sides should be blessed, the Rebbe said there aren't both sides, there's only one side. And so that's in a sense why I want. Well, first of all, I had to obviously establish the fact that I had made that the Rebbe's concern. The first draft of the chapters, I am one of those readers who actually shows my books. I have a coterie of people I show my books to. I always show it to people who think like me also, but then I show it to people who are to the right of me, people who are to the left of me, different, a whole bunch of different groups of people. And one of my friends, said in your opening chapter, he says, you're just focusing on what the Rebbe did for Jews. And I had the Chisholm story in it, but much later in the book. And I realized I wanted people to immediately recognize this was a different sort of rabbi. Yes, so you happen to be right. The Rebbe did always emphasize in that meeting with Dinkins, when Dinkins said, we want to work for both sides, and the Rebbe said there was one side. And he actually, in that regard, used the analogy of America being a melting pot. Because, melting pot often was used originally to argue for assimilation. He felt people could maintain their identity, but have a common sense of vision. Anyway, thank you for raising that point. But I wanted to explain to you what my calculations were. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Take one. I promise any other question I will give a very short answer to. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Rabbi Telushkin.
Hello.
I'm here because I can't read, I'm blind, but I listened to your book on audio, and I felt it was you must have spent an awful lot of time researching it. My question is this: why is there not more being done for the older Jewish people to give them daycare centers and group homes to go to where they can be with educate, where they can get a kosher meal and they don't have to go and explain every single thing. Right now I go to a daycare center, I am the only Jewish person there.
Your question is a totally legitimate and a totally fair one, and more really needs to be done. My contribution to it is that my wife just became a chaplain and is working in a Jewish old age home, and in an old age home that has many Jews, and she sees her mission is there. Well, one of the things the Rebbe did emphasize very much, thank you. One of the things, I'm really sorry, last thing I want to do is cut you off, but I'm sort of sorry, but the Rebbe put great emphasis on the fact he didn't want people to retire, and he didn't want people to stop learning. And whenever he's...
Until I was 73 years old, and then I decided I couldn't work.
Listen, my heart goes out to you, and losing your sight is actually the thing, of all the afflictions I could imagine happening, it's the one I most fear. I'm sorry. By the way, one last point, I just want to end on another note. One of the things I remember is that the Rebbe did every afternoon. The Rebbe had a crazy schedule. You know, there's a man named Yitzchak Bloch who was studying at Harvard as a young man, and then he came to Chabad one summer, and he decided he wanted to leave Harvard and study at the yeshiva. So he goes to meet with the Rebbe, and he asks her, Rabbi Chodakov, can I have a meeting? Chabad was much smaller in those days. It was like 1952. So Rabbi Chodakov says to him, come Thursday at 10. So the guy, Bloch, wakes up very early in the morning, shows up at 10 o'clock at Chabad, and everybody asks, what are you doing here? He said, I have a meeting with the Rebbe at 10 p.m. The Rebbe only met people late at night. You know, Bloch was a young man from Nashville, Tennessee. If somebody says, I'm going to meet you at 10, he assumed it was a.m. When Rabin went to meet with the Rebbe, Yehuda Avner, who was his assistant at the time, said, and Rabin said to him, and make sure she's a lo b'sha'ah meshuga, and make sure he doesn't do it at some crazy hour. So the Rebbe would often come home at 3, even sometimes 4 in the morning, but one thing he always made sure was at some point during the day, he always had tea and spoke with his wife. And he wanted to always make sure, because there was a great closeness there. Again, I'm very sorry for the points that you raised, and I hope that more can really be done. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Telushkin. Thanks everyone for coming. Remember, take upon yourself a good resolution in honor of the 25th Yortzeit, which will be a week from this Shabbos. And everyone is invited to go outside over there, try to get a book. Rabbi Telushkin will be there and we'll sign it. We'll also be Dominic Meyer. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks all.